The radio crackled 3 times before the voice came through. Colonel Werner Brandt stood in a dim command bunker 12 kilometers southeast of Dresden, surrounded by 40 officers who had stopped breathing. The broadcast from Hamburg repeated the words that would shatter what remained of the Third Reich: Adolf Hitler was dead. He had fallen in Berlin. The Führer was gone. Nobody moved. The single light bulb above them flickered as Soviet artillery shook the earth somewhere to the east. Brandt watched the faces around him transform. Some men wept openly. Others stared at nothing, their eyes empty. A few laughed, strange, broken sounds that died quickly in the cold underground air. Major Karl Ehlers moved first. The 34-year-old veteran of Stalingrad and Kursk pulled his Walther pistol and fired 3 rounds into the radio. Sparks flew. Silence followed. Lies, he screamed. Enemy propaganda. The Führer would never abandon us. But everyone knew. They had all known for weeks that Berlin was surrounded by 2 million Soviet soldiers. They had heard the desperate transmissions, the calls for reinforcements that didn't exist, the final orders from a bunker that was already a tomb. April 30, 1945, would mark the end of everything they had fought for. Brandt was 52 years old. He had served Germany through 2 wars, earned the Iron Cross twice, and never joined the Nazi Party. He had followed orders because that was what soldiers did. Now he looked at the men around him and saw Germany itself splitting apart. Within an hour, the bunker divided into factions. Ehlers gathered the true believers, men who spoke of fighting to the last bullet, of dying with honor, of joining their leader in glorious death. They numbered perhaps 30, their faces hard with fanatic certainty. Captain Felix Mauer approached Brandt quietly while the others argued. At 26, Mauer carried secrets that could have gotten him shot. In 1943, he had forged documents that allowed 2 Jewish families to escape to Switzerland. He had lived with that secret for 2 years, watching the regime he served commit horrors he couldn't stop. "Colonel," Mauer whispered, "the Americans are 40 kilometers west. The Soviets are 20 kilometers east and advancing. If we surrender to the Americans, we live. If we stay here, we die, or worse, the Soviets take us." Brandt knew what Soviet captivity meant. Of the 90,000 German soldiers captured at Stalingrad in 1943, fewer than 6,000 would ever return home. The Soviets had lost 20 million people to German invasion. They were not interested in mercy. Young Lieutenant Hans Vogel stood between both groups, unable to choose. He was 19 years old, drafted from university 6 months ago, trained for 3 weeks, and sent to a war that was already lost. He thought of his mother alone in Hamburg, his fiancée waiting in Munich. He had never fired his rifle at another human being. He didn't want to die for a dead man's dream. The arguments grew louder. Someone mentioned the werewolf units, guerrilla fighters who would continue resistance after Germany fell. Someone else spoke of the Alpine Redoubt, the mythical fortress in the mountains where the Reich would make its last stand. Brandt knew these were fantasies. There was no redoubt. There were only ruins and corpses and a country that had destroyed itself. He walked outside alone. The night air smelled of smoke and burning fuel. To the east, the horizon glowed orange where Soviet artillery pounded German positions. Somewhere in the darkness, tanks were moving. He could feel the vibration through his boots. Brandt had been a soldier for 30 years. He had believed in duty, in honor, in serving something greater than himself. Now he stood in the ashes of everything he had known and asked himself the question he had avoided since 1933, what was it all for? The conquered nations? The millions dead? The cities turned to rubble? His own men, boys really, dying in ditches for a leader who had just killed himself rather than face judgment. He thought of his wife, dead from typhus in 1944. His son, killed at Normandy. His daughter, missing somewhere in the chaos of the Eastern Front. Everything he had loved was gone. Everything he had served was collapsing, but inside that bunker were men who could still live. Men with families waiting for them. Men who deserved a chance to see tomorrow. Brandt walked back inside. The argument stopped. Every eye turned to him. Ehlers stood with his hand on his pistol, his jaw tight with fury. Mauer waited near the door, ready to run or fight. Vogel looked at Brandt with desperate hope, silently begging for someone to tell him what to do. The colonel looked at them all, the believers, the doubters, the frightened, the lost. He was their commanding officer. Whatever came next was his responsibility. "We move west at 0400, he said quietly. "Anyone who wants to live comes with me. Anyone who wants to die can stay." Ehlers stepped forward, his face twisted with rage and something that might have been grief. "You're a traitor, Werner. After everything we've been through." Brandt met his eyes. They had saved each other's lives at Stalingrad. Now they stood as enemies. "I'm a German," Brandt replied. "Germany will need men to rebuild. Dead men build nothing." He turned away before Ehlers could respond. There was much to do before dawn. The road west looked like the end of the world. Colonel Werner Brandt stood at the head of a convoy of 60 men, watching thousands of refugees stream past in the gray dawn of May 1, 1945. Women pushed handcarts loaded with everything they owned. Children walked barefoot through the mud, their faces blank with exhaustion. Old men carried bundles on their backs, moving slowly toward anywhere that wasn't here. Behind them, the thunder of Soviet artillery grew closer. Marshal Konev's first Ukrainian front was racing toward the Elbe River, determined to reach the Americans before the war ended. Every hour that passed brought the Red Army closer. Every hour was borrowed time. Ehlers had taken 30 men into the forest before dawn. He'd said nothing to Brandt, just a long look across the bunker, 15 years of friendship ending in silence. Now he was gone, leading his believers toward a guerrilla war that couldn't be won. Brandt wondered how long they would last. Days, perhaps. Maybe only hours. The convoy moved out at 0430. They had 3 trucks, 2 motorcycles, and whatever fuel they could scavenge. Brandt rode in the lead vehicle with Captain Mauer and Lieutenant Vogel. The young lieutenant hadn't slept. His hands trembled slightly as he checked his rifle for the 10th time. "Have you ever killed anyone?" Mauer asked quietly. Vogel shook his head. "I was trained as a radio operator. They sent me to the front 3 weeks ago. I've never even seen the enemy up close." Mauer said nothing. He had seen the enemy many times. He had killed men at distances so close he could smell their breath. It changed nothing. You still dreamed about their faces. The first village they passed had been burned. Bodies lay in the street, civilians, shot in the back while running. A painted sign on a wall read, "Traitors die." The SS had been here, executing anyone who spoke of surrender. In the final days of the Reich, Germans were killing Germans. Brandt ordered the convoy to keep moving. There was nothing they could do for the dead. By noon, they had covered only 15 kilometers. The roads were clogged with wrecked vehicles, abandoned equipment, and endless streams of refugees. Twice they had to push burned trucks off the road just to pass. Once they found a staff car with 4 officers still inside, all dead from Soviet strafing runs. Mauer recognized one of them, a general he had served under in 1942. Now the man was just another corpse rotting in the spring sun. Around 1400, they stopped at what had been a field hospital. Tents stretched across a muddy field. The smell hit them 50 meters away: blood, infection, death. Inside, wounded soldiers lay on stretchers with no medicine, no doctors, nothing but other wounded men trying to help each other die slower. A medical orderly approached Brandt. "We have 200 wounded," he said. His voice was flat, exhausted beyond feeling. "No morphine. No bandages. Half of them won't survive the night." "Can any walk?" Brandt asked. "Maybe 30. The rest?" The orderly shrugged. "We're waiting for the Soviets." Brandt took the 30 who could walk. He couldn't save everyone. He couldn't save anyone, really. He could only keep moving and hope the Americans would take them in. That night, they stopped in a forest to rest. Captain Maurer sat beside Lieutenant Vogel, and in the darkness, he told the young man his secret. In 1943, I forged travel documents for 2 Jewish families. 12 people. I helped them reach Switzerland. Vogel stared at him. That's treason. You could have been shot. I know. Maurer lit a cigarette, the flame briefly illuminating his tired face. I watched what we were doing. The deportations. The camps. I couldn't stop any of it. But I could save 12 people. So I did. Vogel was quiet for a long time. Then he spoke, his voice barely audible. I never believed any of it. The racial theories, the destiny of the Reich, it all sounded like madness to me. But I was afraid. I kept my mouth shut and did what I was told. So did most of us, Maurer said. That's how it happened. Millions of people too afraid to speak. At 0600 the next morning, Soviet tanks found them. The attack came without warning, shells screaming out of the morning mist, explosions tearing through the convoy. One truck disintegrated in a ball of fire. Men scattered into the trees, firing blindly at shapes they couldn't see. Brandt was hit in the left shoulder. The impact spun him around and dropped him in the mud. Through the pain, he saw his men dying, cut down by machine gun fire, crushed under tank treads, blown apart by high explosive rounds. The engagement lasted 22 minutes. When it ended, 31 of his 60 men were dead. The survivors ran west, carrying their wounded, leaving their dead behind. By dawn on May 2, they reached a ridge overlooking an open field. On the far side, perhaps a kilometer away, Brandt could see American vehicles. Jeeps. Trucks. Soldiers in olive drab uniforms. Safety. Life. Everything they had fought to reach, but between them and the Americans lay 1,000 meters of open ground. And behind them, growing louder every minute, came the sound of Soviet engines. The morning sun broke through the clouds and turned the field into a sea of golden light. Colonel Werner Brandt stood at the edge of the tree line, his wounded shoulder burning with every breath, and stared at the 1,000 meters of open ground between his men and survival. On the far side, American soldiers watched through binoculars. They didn't move. They had orders not to engage the Soviets. The alliance still held, barely, behind Brandt. The rumble of T-34 tanks grew louder. The Soviets were 5 minutes away, maybe less. 29 German soldiers remained from the original 60. Most were wounded. All were exhausted. None had slept in 48 hours. Then Brandt noticed the refugees. Somewhere during the night, a group of civilians had attached themselves to his convoy, 40 people, mostly women and children, following the soldiers in desperate hope of protection. They huddled at the forest's edge, their faces white with fear. A girl no older than 6 clutched a ragged doll. An old woman prayed silently, her lips moving without sound. Colonel. Captain Maurer appeared beside him. We can make it across if we run. But the civilians, Brandt understood. His men could sprint a kilometer in under 5 minutes. The civilians, the children, the elderly, the wounded, would take 3 times that long. The Soviets would cut them down in the open field. For a moment, he considered leaving them. It would be the smart choice, the practical choice. His duty was to his men, not to strangers who had chosen to follow him. No one would blame him, but Brandt remembered the burned village. The bodies in the street. The painted sign, "Traitors die." For 12 years, Germany had abandoned its humanity in pursuit of conquest. Maybe it was time to take some of it back. Maurer, get the civilians moving. Everyone who can't fight starts crossing now. The rest of us hold the tree line. Lieutenant Hans Vogel stepped forward. His hands had stopped shaking. Something had changed in his eyes overnight. The fear was still there, but beneath it was something harder. I'll stay, Colonel. Brandt looked at the boy, because that's what he was, really, just a boy, and saw the man he was becoming. Can you shoot? Vogel checked his rifle. "I can learn fast." They had perhaps 30 rifles, 2 machine guns salvaged from the convoy, and whatever ammunition remained in their pockets. Against Soviet tanks and infantry, it was nothing. It was suicide. But it might buy 15 minutes. 15 minutes could save 40 lives. Maurer organized the civilians with calm efficiency. He put the strongest adults in front to set the pace, placed the children in the middle where they'd be protected, and assigned 3 wounded soldiers to help the elderly. Then he started them moving across the field. The first Soviet tanks emerged from the forest 400 meters east. Brandt counted 6 T-34s and at least 2 companies of infantry, perhaps 300 men against his 29. The mathematics of death. "Hold fire until they're in range," he ordered. "Make every shot count." The Soviets advanced in standard formation, infantry spread behind the tanks for cover. They weren't rushing. They had time. They had numbers. They had everything except mercy. At 200 meters, Brandt gave the order. German rifles cracked along the tree line. Soviet soldiers fell. The tanks stopped, their turrets swinging toward the source of fire. Then the world exploded. The next 20 minutes existed outside of time. Brandt fired until his rifle grew hot in his hands, then fired more. He saw men die on both sides, young men, old men, men with families and dreams and futures that would never come. A shell exploded 10 meters to his left and threw him against a tree. His ears rang. Blood ran down his face. He kept firing. Vogel fought like a man possessed. The terror had burned away, leaving only the desperate need to survive, to protect, to matter. He dragged a wounded comrade behind cover while bullets cracked past his head. He picked up a fallen soldier's rifle when his own jammed. He screamed things he wouldn't remember later. Halfway across the field, Maurer looked back. The tree line was disappearing in smoke and fire. He could see German soldiers falling, their positions being overrun. But the civilians were still moving. The children were crying but walking. The old woman was still praying. Then the Americans moved. A young lieutenant named James Wheeler, 23 years old, from a small town in Ohio, watched the slaughter through his binoculars and decided he didn't care about orders anymore. He ordered his platoon forward. American vehicles raced onto the field, machine guns blazing over the heads of the fleeing civilians. The Soviet advance stopped. Their orders were to avoid conflict with American forces. The alliance was fragile, but it still held. Tank commanders radioed for instructions. Infantry pulled back to defensive positions. In that pause, the last civilians reached the American lines. Maurer carried the 6-year-old girl the final 100 meters. She had dropped her doll somewhere in the field. She didn't cry about it. When the firing stopped, 18 German soldiers lay dead in the tree line. Brandt was among the survivors, barely. He'd been shot twice more, once in the leg and once in the side. Medics loaded him onto a stretcher while American soldiers secured the field. The last thing he saw before losing consciousness was a Soviet officer standing at the edge of the forest. The man looked at the German bodies scattered among the trees. Then he raised his hand in a slow salute and turned away. The war, for Brandt and his men, was finally over. The hospital tent smelled of antiseptic and blood. Colonel Werner Brandt lay on a narrow cot, staring at the canvas ceiling, listening to the sounds of men recovering from wounds that would mark them forever. 7 days had passed since the field. 7 days since Germany surrendered unconditionally to the Allied powers. May 8, 1945, Victory in Europe Day, had come and gone while he drifted in and out of consciousness. He had survived 3 gunshot wounds. The doctors said he was lucky. Brandt didn't feel lucky. He felt old and hollow and uncertain what to do with the life he hadn't expected to keep. American interrogators came every afternoon. They were professional, thorough, patient. They asked about troop movements, command structures, supply lines. They asked about the camps, the concentration camps that Allied soldiers had been liberating across Germany. Brandt told them what he knew, which wasn't much. He had heard rumors, seen trains heading east loaded with people who never came back. He had chosen not to ask questions. That silence, he understood now, was its own kind of crime. "I never killed civilians," he told the interrogator, a captain from Massachusetts who spoke excellent German. "I followed orders. I served my country." "Your country killed 6 million Jews," the captain replied without emotion. "Your country started a war that killed 60 million people. What did you think was happening?" Brandt had no answer. What could he say? That he had closed his eyes? That duty had become an excuse for cowardice? The truth was simpler and more terrible. He had known, on some level, and he had done nothing. That guilt would live in him longer than the bullet wounds. Captain Felix Mauer received news that changed everything. One of the Jewish families he had saved in 1943, the Rosenbergs, a couple with 2 children, had written to American authorities. They testified that a German officer named Mauer had risked his life to forge their documents and arrange their escape to Switzerland. They were alive because of him. They wanted the Americans to know. When the camp commander showed him the letter, Mauer broke down crying. It was the first time he had cried since his father died in 1938. He stood in the commander's tent, tears running down his face, unable to speak. 12 people. In all the darkness, he had saved 12 people. It didn't balance the scale of what Germany had done. Nothing could balance that scale. But it was something. It was proof that even in the worst times, some choices still mattered. Lieutenant Hans Vogel walked through the prisoner camp like a ghost. He was 19 years old, technically an adult, but he felt like he had aged decades in the past week. The boy who had trembled in the bunker was gone. The man who remained didn't know who he was yet that he wrote letters to his mother and his fiancée. The words came slowly, painfully. "How do you explain what you've seen? The burning villages. The bodies in the road. The field where he had killed men for the first time, watching them fall and feeling nothing but the desperate need to survive. He had crossed some boundary that couldn't be uncrossed. He would carry those faces forever. On May 10th, word reached the camp about Ehlers. His guerrilla group had lasted 72 hours. They had ambushed a Soviet patrol, killed 8 men, and melted back into the forest. But the Soviets had hunted them without rest, surrounding them in a bombed-out farmhouse near Dresden. Rather than surrender, Ehlers had shot himself. His last words, according to a survivor who later reached American lines, "Tell Brandt he was right." Brandt heard the news in his hospital bed. He closed his eyes and remembered Ehlers as a young lieutenant in 1930, eager and idealistic, certain that Germany would rise again from the humiliation of Versailles. They had climbed together through the ranks, survived Stalingrad together, saved each other's lives more times than either could count. Now Ehlers was dead, and Brandt couldn't even bury him. That evening, Mauer and Vogel visited Brandt's tent. The 3 survivors sat together as the sun set over the camp, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. Somewhere beyond the wire, birds were singing. It was the first peaceful sound any of them had heard in months. "What happens now?" Vogel asked. He sounded young again, uncertain, looking to older men for guidance. Brandt considered the question. Germany lay in ruins. Cities that had stood for centuries were rubble. Millions were dead, millions more were displaced, and the world would never trust Germans again, not for generations, perhaps not for centuries. "We rebuild," he said finally. "We can't undo what happened. We can't bring back the dead or heal the wounds. But we can choose what we do next. We can be better than what we were." Mauer nodded slowly. "I'm going to find the Rosenbergs. I want to see the children, see that they're really alive. Then." He paused. "Then I don't know. Something useful. Something that helps." Vogel said nothing. He was watching the sunset, thinking about all the futures that had been erased by the war, all the men who would never grow old, all the children who would never be born. He had survived, but survival felt like its own kind of burden. He would have to earn it somehow. He would have to make it mean something. Brant closed his eyes. Not to sleep, to remember. All the faces. All the names. The men who had followed him into the field and never walked out. The civilians they had saved. The ones they couldn't save. He would carry them forever. That was the price of survival, that was the cost of being human.